All right, guys, we're on chapter 5, the last chapter of Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. This is the second part. We're going to get as far as we can. Not sure we're going to finish it. It will be probably over 30 minutes, 16 pages. So after completing his song, the buffoon started collecting money. He began with the Russians, who were openly generous, and then he mounted the stairs. But insolent as he may have been during the performance, he was very obsequious up here. Bowing and scraping, he skulked between the tables, baring his strong teeth in a smile of cunning servility, or baring his teeth while the two menacing furrows remained between his red brows. As he gathered in his livelihood, the guests studied the exotic creature with a mingling of curiosity and some repugnance. They tossed coins into his felt hat with their fingertips, making sure not to touch it. The suspension of the physical distance between the performer, no matter how talented, and his respectable audience always creates a certain embarrassment. The musician felt this awkwardness and tried to apologize by groveling. He reached Aschenbach, and with him came that smell which no one else seemed concerned about. "Listen," said the solitary man quietly, almost mechanically. "They're disinfecting Venice. Why?" The jokester answered hoarsely, "On account of the police. It's the law, signor, because of the heat in the Sirocco. The Sirocco is oppressive. It's not conducive to good health." He spoke as if surprised that anyone could ask such a question, and with the flat of his hand he demonstrated how oppressive the Sirocco was. "So there's no illness in Venice," Aschenbach murmured through his teeth. The buffoon's facial muscles fell into a grimace of comical helplessness. "Illness? What sort of illness? Is a Sirocco an illness? Could our police be an illness? You're joking. An illness? Not on your life. A preventive measure, you understand? A police action against the effects of the oppressive weather." He gesticulated. "Fine," Aschenbach again murmured tersely, flinging an unduly large coin into the hat. Then he dismissed him with a glance. The man obeyed, grinning as he bowed several times, but before he even reached the steps, two hotel employees pounced on him, and their faces close to his. They cross-examined him in whispers. He shrugged, reassured them, swore that he'd been discreet. It was plain to see. When they released him, he went back down to the garden, and after briefly conferring with his colleagues under the arc lamp, stepped forward to express his gratitude in a farewell encore. It was a song that the solitary man had, to his knowledge, never heard before, a brazen hit in an incomprehensible dialect with a laughing refrain which the group took up at regular intervals, roaring with mirth. The words would then stop, as would the instrumental accompaniment, leaving nothing but laughter arranged in some kind of rhythmic pattern, yet modulated in a very natural sounding way. And the highly talented soloists in particular managed to produce the most deceptively lifelike guffaws. By restoring the artistic distance between him and his distinguished onlookers, he had regained all his impudence, so that his artificial laughter, insolently dispatched to the terrace, was a laughter of utter scorn. He sobbed, his voice faltered, he pressed his hand to his mouth, he contorted his shoulders, and at the right moment his untamed laughter bellowed out of him, and with such verisimilitude that it became contagious, infecting the spectator, so that a groundless hilarity spread out, feeding purely on itself. But this seemed only to pump up the singer's merriment. He bent his knees, he slapped his thighs, he held his sides. He was ready to explode. He no longer laughed, he shrieked. He pointed his finger at the terrace as if there were nothing more hilarious in the world than that laughing audience. And finally, everyone in the garden and on the veranda was laughing, even the waiters, bellhops, and porters in the doorways. Aschenbach was no longer lounging in his chair. He sat erect, as if about to fight or flee. But the laughter, the hospital smell wafting up to him, and the nearness of the beauty coalesced in a dreamlike spell that, indestructible and inescapable, held his head, his mind captive. Amid the general commotion and amusement, he stole a glance at Taggio, and in so doing he noticed that when the beauty responded to his glimpse, he likewise remained serious, virtually attuning his own demeanor and expression to Aschenbach's, as if the general mood of the place had no hold on the boy because the adult stayed aloof. There was something so disarming, so overwhelming about that childlike and suggestive obedience, that the gray-haired man barely resisted concealing his face in his hands. He also felt that when Taggio occasionally sat up straight and drew a deep breath, it meant that his chest was constricted and he was heaving a sigh of relief. "He is sickly, he probably won't grow old," Aschenbach mused again, with the neutrality that is sometimes a strange emancipation of euphoria and yearning, and his heart was filled with sheer concern or with sheer concern, but also reckless satisfaction. Meanwhile, the Venetians had finished and were making their exit. Applause accompanied them, and their leader did not fail to spice up his departure with a few more pranks. The guests laughed at the way he bowed and scraped and blew kisses at them, and so he did twice as much. When his people were gone, he pretended to back into a lamppost, hurting himself badly, so that doubled up in pain, he barely crept to the gate. Once there, he finally yanked off the mask of the comical unfortunate, straightened up, indeed elastically leaped up, impudently stuck out his tongue at the spectators on the terrace, and slipped into the darkness. The audience dispersed. Taggio had long since left the balustrade, but to the annoyance of the waiters, the solitary man sat at his small table, nursing the rest of his pomegranate beverage. Night wore on, time crumbled. Many years earlier, his parents had had an hourglass in their home. He could suddenly see the frail and meaningful little device as if it were standing before him. The fine rusty red sand dribbled soundlessly through the glassy narrowness, and as it ran low in the upper bulb, a small raging vortex formed in the lower one. The very next afternoon, the obstinate man took another step, invading the outer world, and this time with all possible success. He entered the British Travel Bureau on Piazza di San Marco, where he changed some money, and then, playing the distrustful foreigner, he asked his irksome question. The clerk serving him was a young, tweedy Englishman with close-set eyes and hair parted down the middle, and with a sedate integrity that seemed so alien, so bizarre, in the roguishly quick-witted South. With a sedate integrity seemed so alien, so bizarre, in the roguishly quick-witted South, he began. No reason to worry, sir, an almost meaningless formality. Such measures are often taken to forestall the unhealthy effects of the heat and the sirocco. But as he glanced up, his blue eyes met the stranger's bleak and somewhat weary scowl, which was focused on the clerk's lips. The Englishman reddened. That, he then murmured somewhat emotionally, is the official explanation which they see fit to insist on here. But I can tell you that there's more to it than that. And now he told the truth in a sincere and comfortable way. For several years now, Indian cholera had been showing a greater and greater tendency to spread and wander. Originating in the hot morasses of the Ganges Delta, the disease had ridden with the mephitic breath of that lush and useless primordial island jungle which people avoid and where the tiger crouches in the bamboo thickets. So the Indian cholera in the Ganges Delta. Next, the epidemic had raged and raged with unusual vehemence throughout Hindustan, spreading eastward to China and westward to Afghanistan and Persia, and then following the main caravan routes that had carried its horrors to Astrakhan and even Moscow. But while Europe was terrified that the specter might travel there by land, it had been transported overseas by Syrian merchant ships, cropping up almost simultaneously in several Mediterranean ports. Next, it had reared its head in Toulon and Malaga, showed its mask at several points in Palermo and Naples, and apparently settled in for good throughout Calabria and Apulia, Calabria and Apulia. However, the northern part of the peninsula had been spared, but in mid-May of this year, on one and the same day, Venice had discovered the dreadful vibrios and the blackened, emaciated corpses of a dock worker and a female grocer. These cases were covered up. Within a week, however, there were 10 more, then 20, then 30, and in various neighborhoods to boot. An Austrian provincial, returning to his small town after a brief holiday in Venice, had died with all the unambiguous symptoms. And that was how the first rumors about the affliction in the lagoon city had gotten into the German newspapers. The Venetian authorities replied that the health conditions in the city had never been better, and they took the most necessary precautions to ward off any problems. But the food supply must have gotten contaminated, meat, milk, or vegetables, for although denied and hushed up, death ate its way through the narrow lanes, and was particularly encouraged by the premature summer heat which warmed up the canal waters. Indeed, the pestilence seems to have revived its strength, increasing the tenacity and productivity of its pathogens. Recovery was rare. 80% of the stricken died, and in the most horrible way, for the onslaught was extremely savage, with the illness often appearing in its most malignant form, known as the dry type. This diseased body could not even expel the masses of water secreted by the blood vessels. Within just hours, the patient shriveled up, hoarsely lamenting and convulsively choking on his pitch-like blood. The victim was fortunate, however, if, as sometimes occurred, a slight malaise was followed by a deep coma, from which he seldom, if ever, awoke. By early June, the quarantine barracks of the Hôpital Civil had quietly filled up. The 2 orphan asylums had a shortage of space, and there was a dreadful coming and going between the dock of the Fondamente Nouveau in San Michele, the graveyard island, but the city fathers were concerned about overall damage to the vast tourist trade about the painting exhibition that had recently opened in the public gardens. They were worried that a panic might break out, that the whole town might lose its reputation, that business would suffer if tourists kept away in droves. And these fears proved more powerful than love of truth and respect for international agreements. These fears compelled the authorities to uphold their obstinate policy of concealment and denial. Venice's chief medical official, a meritorious man, had indignantly resigned and had been surreptitiously replaced by a more compliant individual, a more corrupt dude. The population knew about it, and this corruption in high places, together with the prevailing insecurity, the anxiety about the state of emergency caused by death as it stalked the city, had a certain demoralizing impact on the lower classes. These factors encouraged their unsavory and antisocial tendencies, which were manifested as indecency, shamelessness, and a rising crime rate. Contrary to the norm, one can see an abnormally high number of drunks in the evenings. Nasty riffraff, it was said, made the streets unsafe at night. There were many muggings and even murders, for allegedly more victims were actually poisoned by their own relatives than carried off by the epidemic. And professional vice assumed more obnoxious and dissolute forms which were otherwise known here and were at home only in southern Italy or in the Orient. The Englishman had summed up the most important aspects of the situation. You would do well, he concluded, to leave today rather than tomorrow. The quarantine cannot be more than a day or two off, meaning like you can't go anywhere. Thank you, said Aschenbach, and left the bureau. The piazza was sunless and sweltering. Unaware foreigners sat on the cafe terraces or covered with pigeons stood in front of the cathedral, watching the birds teeming, beating their wings, jostling one another, picking the corn kernels from cupped hands, feverishly agitated in triumphant possession of the truth, with a taste of nausea in his mouth and a fantastic horror in his heart. The solitary man paced up and down the flagstones of the magnificent courtyard. He weighed the possibility of a decent and purifying action. After dinner tonight, he could go to the lady with the pearls and say to her what he was already drafting word for word. Madame, permit a stranger to offer you a piece of advice, a warning, which self-interest is withholding from you. Leave Venice immediately with Tadzio and your daughters. Venice is infested. Then, after saying farewell by placing his hand on the head of the agent of a jeering deity, he could turn away and flee from this quagmire. But he also sensed that he was far from seriously desiring to take such a step. It would bring him back, would restore him to himself, but the man who was beside himself despises nothing more than becoming his old self again. He recalled a white building adorned with inscriptions that glistened in the sunset while his mind's eye had gotten lost in their translucent mysticism. Then he pictured that strange figure of a wanderer who had aroused the aging man's adolescent yearning, his roving desire for distant foreign places and the thought of ongoing home, of regaining his prudence and sobriety. His strenuous self-mastery was so repugnant that his face twisted into a grimace of physical disgust. They want us to keep quiet, he whispered vehemently, and I will keep quiet. The awareness of his complicity, his connivance, intoxicated him. The wary small amounts of wine intoxicate a weary brain. So the awareness of his complicity, his connivance intoxicated him the way small amounts of wine intoxicate a weary brain. He was haunted by the image of the afflicted and neglected city, a wild vision kindling his hopes, which were incomprehensible, utterly unreasonable, and tremendously sweet. For an instant he had dreamed of tender happiness, but what was that compared with these expectations? What use were art and virtue against the advantages of chaos? He kept quiet and stayed on. That night he had an appalling dream, if dream is the right word for something both physical and mental that he endured in deepest slumber, an entirely self-contained experience that was concrete to his senses, even though he did not see himself as present and moving through space beyond these events. Instead, they took place in his own soul. They burst in from the outside, violently crushing his resistance, a profound resistance of his mind, and passed through him, devastating and annihilating his sheer existence, his cultured, civilized life. Fear was the beginning, fear and pleasure, and a horrified curiosity about what lay ahead. Night ruled, and his senses listened. For distant turmoil and tumult were approaching, a mixture of noises, rattling, shattering, and muffled thundering, shrill reveling, and a certain howling in a drawn-out U sound, everything imbibed and overtoned with ghastly sweetness by a deeply cooing, brutally insistent flute that in a shamelessly intrusive way bewitched the listener's entrails. But he knew a phrase, obscure yet naming what came, the alien god. A smoky fire glowed. He recognized a mountainous region like the one around his country home, and in the shattered light from a wooded peak there came plunging and rolling and tumbling between trunks and mossy rock fragments, humans, animals, a swarm, a raging horde, flooding the slope with bodies, flames, pandemonium, and a reeling, rounding dance. I'm not sure if I'm going to stop it right here. So he thinks chaos is going to ensue. This would have been a good book to read before COVID, honestly. It's very mirroring, you know. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's leave it right there. Let's leave it right there. Leave a little mystery. So, but he knew a phrase, obscure yet naming what came, the alien god. A smoky fire glowed. He recognized a mountainous region like the one around his country home, and in the tattered light from a wooden peak there came plunging and rolling and tumbling between trunks and mossy rock fragments, humans, animals, a swarm, a raging horde, flooding the slope with bodies, flames, pandemonium, and a reeling, resounding dance. Not really sure what's going on. This took a turn, man. This took a turn, this book. It went from like this creepy artist, just people watching, to some sort of a Indian flu. So I read about 8.5 pages and we have about 10 left. So the last chapter will be 20, 25 minutes. So we'll just do 3 parts.